Welcome to the Simply Authentic podcast with Angie and Tanya, where we hope to inspire you to dream big and push past your fear, empower you to take charge of your own life, and challenge you to be the most authentic self you can be. Welcome back to the Simply Authentic podcast. I'm Angie Mullings.
And I'm Tanya Murfin. So guys, today we're really excited about our guest. We have Anne Roderique-Jones with us of the Ozarks True Crime podcast. So if you are a fellow podcaster, you probably know who she is. And her podcasts currently talk about some things that have happened here in the Ozarks. So we're going to get started and let Annie, which I call her Annie, so that's how you'll hear me refer to her. We are going to get started and hear who Annie is, her background. So Annie, why don't you get us started by telling us where you grew up and what went from there, how you got to your real job.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
So I grew up in Springfield, Missouri. My mom lived in Springfield and my dad actually lived in Hollister. So I went back and forth, but I went to school in Springfield. I went to Mark Twain and Jared and Parkview, and all my family is from the Springfield area. My husband actually went to Greenwood, so he's from the area as well. And we both live in New York City. We moved here in 2007, so quite some time ago, but we go back to the Ozarks quite a bit. I go for work and to see everyone there. So I'm a journalist now. So
very good. So you've written for several travel publications. I noticed Condé Nast and Travel and Leisure. What other publications have you written for, and in what format?
A lot over the years. I started out in bridal at the Knot magazine, and I worked there for 5 years, so I exclusively wrote about weddings. I interned at Savor magazine, so I did some food writing, and I've written for Southern Living, a lot of the Hearst and Condé Nast publications, and primarily, like you said, Travel and Leisure. I'm writing about travel pretty much more than anything these days. Vogue. Ones you might find in a supermarket, and then some that you don't, and then some newspapers as well, but not daily newspaper reporting or anything, just more travel and lifestyle.
Got it. So Annie, just to kind of highlight that, I was looking at your Instagram one night and saw that you had recently wrote an article for Travel and Leisure magazine about a place in Italy that you travel to every year and stay a month with your husband. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's just it's a tiny little town. It's called Ospedaletti, and it's really small. It's right on the water. It's very chill. It's not pretentious or fancy. Very simple but beautiful. And we rent an apartment, just a small little one-bedroom apartment, and we stay there for a month, a little bit more in the summertime, which has been really nice. And both of us are really lousy at Italian, but we're trying to learn. And because it is small, you kind of get to know all the people there, which is really lovely. And it has a great bike path if you're into biking or running. And it's on the water, so you can swim laps, and you can kind of make up for all that food that you eat all the time while you're there.
Yeah.
So it's really nice. And because we're in New York, it's a pretty quick flight. Just nonstop flight, which is very nice. So
yes,
that's awesome.
So with all of your travels, what are your favorite places that you've been?
Gosh, I really loved Laos. I like Southeast Asia quite a bit. It just feels so different. I think the language is different. The culture is so different and interesting, and the food is so unique and great. So I really liked Laos and Cambodia a lot. We did those two together. I'd say that's probably one of my favorite areas of the world to travel to.
Yeah,
That's interesting. I did not expect that answer.
No, neither did I.
We may have to have you back on just to talk about travel,
Okay.
period. But I know, you're trained as a journalist, and how does a journalist decide that they're going to do a podcast on true crime?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question because I obviously was not trained in anything remotely resembling true crime. I was writing about like bridesmaid dresses. So,
Right.
But I started listening to true crime podcasts like so many people, started with Serial and listened to Dirty John. And so I was thinking about the first season and the subject of the 3 missing women. And I thought, well, maybe I'll write a book that's like, or write a feature article because that's kind of what I just knew. But, sometimes when there isn't this like tidy ending, it really serves better to do it on a podcast than say a book. And
Sure.
so I just kind of thought like, well, maybe this would make an interesting podcast and it would give me a chance to really dive in versus like if you write an article, you only have, let's say 3,000 words versus a podcast is just, you have all the time in the world that you want, or,
Right.
You can, it's kind of like the Wild West. You can kind of just do whatever. So
True.
I decided that I thought that might be a good outlet for it to really be able to dig in and do interviews and all the things that you want to do to like, kind of do the subject justice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Springfield 3, so I know what you're talking about, and probably a lot of locals also know what you're talking about, but the 3 missing women. So give us kind of a snapshot into exactly who we are talking about there.
Sure. So it was 2 young women from Springfield, Missouri, Stacy McCall and Susie Streeter, along with Susie's mother, who disappeared in 1992. And it was on 2 of the girls' graduation night. They went to Kickapoo High School, and they've been missing ever since. And, I think it's always been something that everyone in the community has known about and still talks about, because it's just such a, it's such a really sad and really just unique case to have 3 people disappear like that. And it's something that our community, because, the Ozarks is so tight-knit, I think they've always really been invested in that. So I kind of just wanted to explore that story and speak to people who were involved in it. And the podcast really gave us kind of a new platform to do something like that.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'm glad you asked the question, Tanya, because I don't think we can assume that everyone knows the story. We lived it. We were here. But it happened 30 years ago. So
Right.
There are listeners out there who, maybe they know just a little bit about what happened,
Right.
but they don't really understand how it affected Springfield and what a huge story, national story it became.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So was it hard to go back 30 years later? Here we are, and you're coming back to people who have talked about this for a long time. You're interviewing persons involved with the family, with the police force, with detectives, with, you're going back to a story that's 30 years old, but still it's palpable probably to most of those people. Was it hard to get the subject brought back up again 30 years later?
I think it was hard for a couple of different reasons, one of which is that some people, 30 years is a really long time, so some people might not remember specific details, or some people might not be alive that were working the case at the time, particular, maybe certain detectives or judges or whatever that
Sure.
might be. But I think it was also difficult because some people didn't know what a podcast was, which I totally understand.
Sure.
And I'm sure you all kind of deal with that,
Yes.
like explaining, like, this is how we're going to tell your story. And, we're not out to exploit anyone. We really, the owner of the company that I work with, the production company, we got trauma training certified. So we were able to really try to work in a way that was respectful and not sensationalizing it, but
Sure.
Also difficult in talking to say, Janice McCall, who is one of the girls who's missing her mother, and that's a really sensitive subject, and
Absolutely.
we wanted to be respectful to her, and so it was difficult in that way. You really try not to get too emotionally involved in any story. But that's difficult when you have someone like that that's from your town, and that that you knew about everything growing up. And I was 12 years old when it happened, so you have that that tie in that way. But knowing that you're speaking with someone's mother and siblings, we spoke with Bart Streeter, and just being really respectful of that, but also trying to lay everything out as accurately as possible and presenting different situations.
Yeah. So when you were talking to everyone, and obviously, I've listened to your podcast, and I've heard lots of different interviews over the years, things like that. So this is not an unknown concept, but it was kind of the good old boys. Were there mistakes that the police made? Certainly a different time and place from what we have in Springfield now. But how did you feel about that? Did you feel as you were interviewing people that there was some kind of a cover up, or that things were just mishandled? What was going through your head whenever you were interviewing people?
I think that maybe some people have said that. I can't speak to that because I wasn't working the case at the time. I wasn't a journalist at the time. But I think it was just, really the initial crime scene was compromised, and there's nothing that anyone on the police force could have done about that. That was just, when they got there, and I know that I've worked with Rick Bookout, who's wonderful. He was the first officer on the scene, and is still to this day doing interviews trying to help get this case solved. So, that was already compromised whenever he walked in, and then they were just getting so many tips. I know that there were some national publications that came in and made it more difficult for the local police department, but. As far as it being a good old boys club, I don't really know that. I do know that we had some difficulty during the podcast getting interviews, but I can say that I met with the Springfield Police Department when I was back in Springfield about a month ago, and they have dedicated people on this team that want to solve this really badly. I could never even understand why someone would say it's a cover-up, because they really are still 30 years later working to do that. So, they've been really good about, if I get a tip, I might send it over to them, and they've been good about responding to that since the podcast has come out. So I certainly appreciate that. I think everyone really wants to get it solved. I'm sure it's incredibly frustrating, to those involved, more so the families than anyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and in the podcast, you talk about the Springfield Police Department not returning your calls or your emails. So that's a great update for you to give us, that when you were here last, you spoke to them, and it seems to me, I hear you saying they were willing to speak to you in person and openly told you they're still working to solve it and hope to.
Sure. I mean, and they didn't give me any kind of updates or leads, that's
sure.
And I understand why. I know that it's still an ongoing case, and I hope that, Janice is getting the information that she, wants to get. But as far as, speaking with me, they were really open to it. We had a meeting, and so, yeah, I know that they probably get a lot of requests for press for this particular case, so I'm sure that they have to be pretty selective about when they do speak to someone, and I certainly understand that. I was coming in as, someone doing a podcast that had not really been done about this, in depth at least, and asking for those type of interviews. So, but yeah, I felt like that was really a really good step.
That is good. Agree.
Yeah, you talk to a lot of different people. As you mentioned, you talk to family members, you talk to law enforcement, you talk to friends of Stacy, and those friends telling you, their side of the story. But I'm wondering if anyone who you talked to, did you feel like they were holding back on you? Again, it could just be because I didn't understand the process of a podcast and who is this person who's going to ask me these questions. But did you feel like anyone had more of a story to tell that they were kind of holding back on?
I mean, no, I really don't. I think everyone who was generous enough to give us their time really, I mean, would sit with us for hours and talk about this. So, Janice in particular sat with us at the library center the entire day. I mean, really the entire day. Actually went to a doctor's appointment and came back and finished telling her story. So I don't feel that anyone was holding back per se. I do think that there were people that we wanted to interview that didn't want to be interviewed. So I think it was kind of like if they gave us their time, they gave us what I felt was really a generous amount of time and stories. But there were a lot of people that we weren't able or didn't want to be interviewed. So that was unfortunate. It happens. I mean, I get turned down for interviews all the time. It's not new, but you really want it to happen.
Yeah. And I know that, this isn't a CSI episode and you're not here to solve the crime. You're here to tell the story as a journalist. But was there anything that to you felt like new information that had not been told all those years ago? And, obviously we have social media now and we have so many different ways to communicate, even through email, that 30 years ago we didn't have. So is there anything that stood out to you that, oh gosh, 30 years ago that could have made a difference?
I think probably more so in the second season when we talked about the Feeney family. We had, and with both seasons we had, I had numerous emails of tips or theories, and some of them were certainly worth pursuing and looking into that I hadn't heard before. But as far as one that could have maybe changed the course, maybe not. It was a young girl who, said that she had saw John Feeney's car in his driveway, and he was the suspect in a case for the murder of his wife and 2 children. And so she said that she had told police that, her dad verified it, and that they had never followed up. That said, she's a very young girl. What do you remember at the time? I'm not discounting anyone, but it was certainly information that someone who was in a professional field, whether they were a detective or an attorney, said, like, I wish we could have had that information at the time.
Yeah. I remember listening to that part and actually thinking to myself, that would have been really helpful to know. And again, we're many years down the road since the Feeney murders as well. Before we switch over to talking about that case, Annie, what was your impression of Bart Streeter? I enjoyed listening to him talk about his mom and sister, and I know that we hadn't really got that opportunity, ever. We heard a lot from, of course, Janice McCall and her family, but the Bart Streeter interview was interesting to me. What was your impression of him?
I thought he seemed very earnest and very vulnerable. It took a lot for me to get that interview with him. He definitely turned me down a lot.
Yeah.
And he has he certainly has a distrust of the media, and I can understand why. I saw some of the clips that he had talked about, particularly television clips on national stations that had really made him and his family look, it was a pretty poor representation, and I could see how that would be really hurtful.
Yes.
If that's something that you had nothing to do with and your mom and sister are gone, that I can't imagine what that would do to a person. And to be treated as the way he's been treated, and he has certainly had his issues with the law, and I don't discount that in any way. Does it mean he would do something like this? I'm not, those seem like 2 very different things.
Right.
So, again, I'm not one to say whether he did it or not, or should be a suspect or not, but I felt in my interview with him, and I had many pre-interviews with him, and I felt that he was very earnest. He really owned up to a lot of the things that he had done wrong in his life and the regrets that he had. And so from an interview perspective, I really appreciated his vulnerability.
Yeah. Agree
What
with
did
that.
you all think of it?
Well, that's what I was going to say. As a listener, it was so raw to me to hear his perspective, because the story's not been told before like you told it. You know, it's a flash across the media. It's a Dateline episode. And so I think it was important for us to hear his side of the story.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious about Robert Craig Cox. You interviewed him, and of course there was during your interviews you also interviewed it was his girlfriend at the time and her daughter that gave some input and maybe misled police in the beginning, saying that he was somewhere he wasn't that night or that day. But I also am interested to hear what you think if he is grandstanding. He says he will come clean once his mother has passed. What was your impression of him?
Well, I didn't interview him for this, unfortunately. He turned down my my request to be interviewed in person, but I do communicate with him via email, and I'm still trying to get an interview with him, and I hope that happens, just so it can kind of, close a circle. I think that it was his at the time fiance girlfriend's daughter that all lived together that I did interview, and that was really, I thought, very eye-opening. She was also very generous with her time and her stories for me. Her mother has Alzheimer's, so I wasn't able to interview her, but
Gotcha.
Yeah, so I thought she had some really interesting stories about him. I think his mother has died, if I'm not mistaken. So
Really?
Whenever I communicate with him via, it's an email system through a prison, trying to secure an interview, I definitely get that part ignored. I think he probably just wants a pen pal, which is not something I'm here for. But I don't know about grandstanding. I'm not like a psychologist. I don't know, what he presents in terms of whether he's truthful or not. I do know that his past record shows that he's probably capable of doing something like this, but I honestly, I don't know whether he's telling the truth. I don't know that his track record shows like a great deal of truth, but again, who knows? I hope that I do get an interview with him at some point, and certainly we'll make that, a bonus episode, and whatever else is on tap for the podcast in the future of it. We want to make, anyone that we can get an interview with after it's come out, which has been done. So hopefully that'll happen with Robert Craig Cox. We'll see.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so that kind of leads into a question of what do you do with any leads that you get? Are you contacted frequently?
Yeah, I'm definitely contacted frequently. And, I think if they make sense, then we pursue them and spend time looking into them and researching them, researching the people behind them. And then we also will pass them along to the Springfield Police Department, of course, too, because really that's, that's their job, and they're the professionals in this. So,
of course.
We pass that along to them.
Yeah.
Great. Well, now I guess we'll switch to the Feeney Murders and talk a little bit about that, because that was season 2 or 3 for you. Two. Okay. So, how did those interviews compare with the Springfield 3 murders? Or I'm sorry, Springfield 3 missing women.
Well, just what you said, honestly, because there was, these were murders and murder victims, and so it was, it was definitely something that had happened to a family. Versus, you don't really know what happened with the Springfield 3. You're not totally sure. So you're really in there, and the first season is kind of about, people guessing who do they think did this, who's capable, what happened to them, where could they be. Let's try to find answers. Versus this one is who did it more than anything. Yeah. And so, and it's really kind of like, did one person do it or not? I think that's really how people looked at it, or how people felt when they listened to it, was whether someone, John Feeney, did this or did not do it. And so it's just kind of more, I guess it leaves the listener with like a different question in their head.
Yeah. Who were some of the most impressionable people you talked to during that, and I know you talked about the young girl that might have saw his car in the driveway that night. Who were others that you talked to?
Well, certainly Cheryl's mother, the fact that she let us into her home. And, this had happened to her daughter and her grandchildren. And so, just something so horrible to happen, the worst thing that could happen to a person. And she let us into her living room and showed us photo albums of her daughter and, answered every single question that we asked of her and hugged us. And, just it was really, really kind of her to do that. And I definitely felt so appreciative of her time. So she was certainly one. I think some of the attorneys that had worked on the case, Rita, she's such an interesting interview, and she knew John and went to high school with John and then ended up working with him as an attorney and then became a police officer. So she kind of was like, did it all. And she was very convicted in the way that she felt. So it was interesting to hear her perspective when, some people, teachers that we may have interviewed, some would say, I don't think so, or some would say, absolutely. So it was just interesting to hear people's opinion on that were actually involved or knew someone there.
And do you continue to get follow-ups on that one? People calling in or writing you or whatever with leads, potential leads?
Yeah, maybe not as much leads right now, more like, whether they think they did it or whatever, or he did it. I get that. When we did have the lead, Brittany, who we felt like was pretty solid, it was, I think it was worth spending the time on that and adding some new information. But I mean, there's always people emailing.
Yeah. I'm sure there are. So in regards to both stories, and I would say I could probably guess what your answer is going to be, but because they're different stories, which one, is there one of them that would leave you with a certain feeling more so than the other? And I don't even know how to describe that feeling that I'm asking you. Is there one that, which I'm assuming the Springfield 3 took more time. Was there more time involved, so therefore you were maybe more invested in the Springfield 3 than you were the Feeneys? What would your opinion be?
Well, I think with the Springfield 3, you hope one day it gets solved.
Yes.
You have that hope.
Agree.
And you know that there are people that are related to the women that are out there, and you want that to happen for them. You want it to happen for the police department. And so I think there's that hope versus the second season. It's there's a double jeopardy. So there's probably nothing more that will happen with that case, unfortunately.
Right.
And so I think you kind of just, you're not oh, it's over and done, but you feel like there's a little bit more of a lid on the box with that one versus the other one is just open and, you explore leads a little bit more carefully. I think the third season, I've just started writing it this week. And so, that one, I probably won't give too much info away, but that one is, it'll be interesting because it's something that happened a long time ago, but it's ongoing now. So I'll give you that as a little teaser. But
perfect.
That one I think it'll allow the listener to follow along in real time.
Yeah.
Okay. And when do you expect for your third season to come out? How long does it take you to produce these, Annie?
Well, I don't do all the work. I work with a production team that I'm in partnership with called Edit Audio, and they do all of the production. They do the editing. They make all the great little noises that you hear in the music.
Yeah.
And so my job is to really research and write, and then interview. So more on that end. So I start out by writing it, and we've already done one interview. This will be more ongoing, but I think we plan to launch this at the end of the year. So
okay.
Yeah. So.
Okay.
Awesome.
Awesome.
We'll look forward to that.
Yes, we sure will.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, you're interviewing people that in one case you still have 3 missing women, and I don't know, as a family member of one of those, I think it could be equally disheartening. First of all, you've got, the missing 3 who you have no idea what happened to your family members. And that, I don't know. That would be very difficult to live with. And then on the other side, if you believed someone got off free of not being convicted, then okay, if he didn't do it, who did? And is anybody looking into that? And if he did do it and got away with it, where does that leave you? So I don't know. Either one would be difficult.
Yeah.
We on our podcast mostly interview people who have a great story. You have a great story. We get to talk about fun things. You're interviewing people that are talking about murder and, crime. And I'm curious if that weighs on you at all.
That's a really good question. I guess it does to some extent. But for so much of my career, I did interview people that had fun stories, or they were like a celebrity has their publicist saying what they can talk about and what they can't, or, a chef that has a new product line, and it is really fun, and I loved that part of my career. But to me, this is so much more raw. The fact that someone is willing to talk to you and tell you a story about, a family member who has been murdered or who is missing, it's such a privilege, I guess, that someone's willing to trust you with that story. So I think that is something that I like more for that reason. That the subjects are really heavy, but, it just depends. After I finished interviewing Janice, my mom and grandma lived together in Springfield, and I went back to their apartment, and I felt really bummed out, just really sad, because I think I was with my mom and grandma too. And but then, sometimes I'll be totally fine after an interview, and maybe someone on the production team might, be upset, and we have this really great support group. There's usually 4 of us who work together, and the owner of the company might say, all right, after we interviewed Cheryl's mother, we all went to a lake in Lake of the Ozarks and went swimming, and just did not look at our phones. If someone needed to cry, they could cry, but kind of, maybe we did some jazzercise classes when we were there last time, which was super fun and a great way to kind of get out of your head a little bit. So I think there's so much more focus on self-care when you think about these things, and
absolutely
that you can kind of decompress a little bit after a heavy interview.
Yeah. So that makes me think of what you said in the beginning of the podcast, that you guys went through trauma training before you did the Springfield 3 podcast or interviews. So did some of that training come back to help all of you cope with these heavy stories?
Yeah. So we did the trauma reporting training after the Springfield 3, before the Feeneys, and it definitely did, because after Springfield 3, it was just interview, boom, write, boom, don't think about it, just get it done. And so then it was really with the Feeney case that we were okay, let's take some time out to process this, to do what you need to do. Some people need nothing after, and some people do need some time to kind of work through some of the really sad and hard things that they listen to. And then also just the way you speak to people. Some people don't, maybe someone wants to be called a survivor instead of a victim, or whatever that may be. You kind of learn how to approach people better in those situations that have gone through that kind of thing. Because again, it's totally different than interviewing, a yoga influencer or whatever. You know? So it was really helpful. It was great.
Well, I think the way that you've done your podcast, your empathy really comes through. I like the fact that you show patience with the people that you're interviewing, and you can tell that you're very thoughtful in your questions and what they're going through.
Thank you. That means a lot. I feel like you all are really good at interviewing too.
Oh,
thanks.
Well, thank you. We're still working on it.
Yeah,
I agree with Angie, and I was thinking while we've been talking that I wanted to compliment you on how well done your podcast is. And by that, you can just tell you you did this for the right reasons, Annie, not for the wrong ones. And I think, a lot of publicity is given to the media and probably journalists who might be sensationalizing things, and I don't think you did that whatsoever. I think you're telling a story in the case of the Springfield 3 to maybe get it solved one day. So
Thank you. And a lot of that is really like the team I work with, Steph, the owner. When we started, before we went into a partnership on this, that was something that's really important to her too. And so, I think about that when I'm in interviews, and I imagine that if I maybe worked with someone that was different, they would be asking, being like, you need to ask this question, or you need to say this to her, or get her to say this. And because of the partnership that I have, it's really about the people before the story. And I do think it's like, you don't really need to sensationalize these. They're pretty sensational on their own.
Agree.
So, yeah,
Right.
but the team is really, really empathetic and wonderful.
Yeah. And I would hope that by you sort of highlighting and going back and revisiting the missing 3, maybe it will shed some light on something. Maybe someone will remember something. I think, if it's locked away, we've obviously talked about how the police department is still investigating, but there's still a small quadrant of people who are talking about it. You get on, a podcast with maybe a broader reach, and someone will know something or hear something. And, I think our hope and prayer is that someday that will be solved for all involved.
Yeah, you all know this, having a podcast, but a podcast is, one, it reaches a different audience, that may not have heard of this particular case or heard of your subject. You're also reaching a much broader audience. It's not like it's the local news. People all over the world listen and care about these things. So you're getting these 20-year-olds who are listening to this who weren't even born, which it does help open that up, just at least to hear the story.
Yeah, for sure. So I have to ask before we wrap up here, there was another murder around here in the Ozarks that happened in 1994 in Fremont Hills, the Revelle murder of George Revelle's wife, Lisa Revelle, was killed in their home. So is that something you've thought of doing an episode on or a season on?
We have thought about it because a lot of people suggest that one.
Yeah.
So I think that, down the road, we certainly plan to make this, more than 2 or 3 seasons. So I think it's a possibility. One thing I think we just have to be really mindful of is that people don't want to hear the same law enforcement and journalists over and over. It's like you can only interview so many people. So I think for us, for this next one, just moving out a little bit to where it's a different police force, a different,
Gotcha.
local journalists, and we don't want to make it too redundant for people, I guess, is kind of what we're looking at. But I think, I think that's such an interesting story, and people are really passionate about that story too. And I had never heard anything about that until we started working on maybe even the Feeney case. And so, it's also the same attorney, I think Eskenazi worked on that one.
Yes.
So we kind of started hearing about it. And so, I think it's something we'd certainly consider.
Yeah.
Okay. I've, in conversations with friends, you're a topic. Well, your podcast is a topic, but not you in particular, Annie, but because I know you, I can say, I know her, but that when you're sitting around, and I think Angie and I have done this before because we knew we were going to interview you, you start talking about all these things and people start giving their theories. And I heard this, and what'd you think about this? And so re-listening to your podcast just kind of brings it all back up. And those of us that grew up around here, we remember, how old we were and what was happening in our lives at that time. So I think that's why it's natural for that Revelle crime to come up as well. So,
Yeah.
Yeah. And you remember that?
uh-huh.
Do you remember the Revelle one? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Yeah, I need to dig into that one a little bit more. I can interview you then if we do that one.
Okay. Yeah. Good idea. Well, we are going to wrap this up, and I am so glad that you have joined us and that your Ozarks link, even though you haven't lived here since you moved away from going to college, I still feel like you're a hometown girl, Annie. And
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me, too.
Yeah, absolutely. So we like to end on a real estate story if you have one, because that's our day job that we do. We always like to hear if our guests have some sort of story
Okay,
they
let
could
me
tell.
think about this. I guess the only real estate story that I have is that my husband and I have bought real estate over the years, and everything we've bought sight unseen.
Oh, wow.
Really?
Yes.
Risk
Everything.
takers then. That's what
I
we've
know.
got.
and they've all been like wonderful places to live.
Wow, that's
Wow.
awesome.
No regrets. So now I
good.
feel like if we ever buy something else, I want to like keep that up.
Yeah.
I'll be your dream client because I'm not going to be a diva about anything.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And really, in our industry, that is something that for years and years, it was really unheard of. I mean, yes, those things happened occasionally when there were, dramatic things going on in people's lives. They needed to move quickly. But in the last couple of years, especially during COVID, we dealt with that a lot. So that's very interesting that you guys have always bought that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you do go to the inspection and you're like,
Of course.
trust.
Yeah.
So far, it's worked out. Yeah. I mean, you can even talk to neighbors before now. It's just like, it's
Exactly.
really interesting how much you can do, just like we're doing this, online. It's like you can do so much of that, and just some good house stalking there, and
Yeah. Oh, yes.
find out everything.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's fun. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been interesting. Yeah.
Yes,
we can't
thank
wait
you
to hear.
so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll be promoting your third season when it comes
Whatever
out.
that is.
Yes, towards the end of the year.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank
Annie.
you.
Take care.
Okay.
Thanks for listening to the Simply Authentic podcast. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram.
Be sure to listen to us on your favorite podcasting app.